Death became propaganda, and the roaring crowd, they became accomplices, trained over generations to equate brutality with justice, to see power in the taking of a life. In this brutal climate, a woman's pregnancy offered no protection. The line between story and reality vanished, swallowed by the arena's insatiable hunger for authenticity. Soon, a woman condemned for a real crime, like treason or religious defiance, was not simply executed. The arena became a classroom for cruelty, teaching the population that the state's power was absolute, reaching even into the womb. Gladiator fights, once the main event, became predictable. This is when the games entered their darkest phase. Inscriptions from this period reference something called moneda extraordinaria, which translates to extraordinary games. This was a careful, bureaucratic euphemism, a sterile phrase hiding horrors too indecent for the official. Sanitized records that Rome wanted to leave for posterity. Their presence would have turned the spectacle into a grim, symbolic execution of both mother and future child, a public and visceral display of absolute power. This wasn't just about punishment. It was a powerful, multi-layered message aimed at any group that might dare to defy Roman authority. To political rivals, it said, "Not only will we destroy you, but we will extinguish your entire bloodline." To rebellious communities, it declared, "Your future generations will never rise to challenge us." To followers of new religions, like early Christians who were often the victims of these spectacles, it was a profound act of psychological warfare. The Romans knew that, for Christians, children represented the future of the faith, the continuation of their community. By executing a pregnant Christian woman, the Romans were not just killing one person. They were performing the symbolic annihilation of the faith's future. It was a declaration shouted to the heavens and to the roaring crowds. Your God cannot save you, and your legacy dies here, today, with Rome's command. This was the ultimate assertion of dominance, a statement that Roman power was total, capable of ending not just a life, but the very possibility of a future. This brutal practice also served to reinforce the social and political hierarchy of the Roman world. The victims were almost always from the lower classes, foreigners, or members of persecuted groups. They were the other, the expendable. Their public suffering reaffirmed the status and security of the Roman citizens watching from the stands. It created a twisted sense of shared identity, a community bonded by their participation as spectators in these acts of state-sanctioned violence. The crowd, by cheering for the death of a pregnant woman, became complicit in the emperor's cruelty, reinforcing his power and their own submission. It's a disturbing chapter of history to confront, one that shows how easily entertainment can be weaponized into a tool of political control. The Roman arena wasn't just a place for games, it was a stage for state terror, where the lines between justice, entertainment, and propaganda were deliberately erased. The memory of these women, whose deaths were turned into a public spectacle, serves as a chilling reminder of how power, when unchecked, can lead to unimaginable cruelty, and how the roar of a crowd can drown out the whispers of humanity. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of history insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. See you next time. The Colosseum doesn't begin with stone. It begins with silence, a kind of ancient hush that settles over the ruins long before the tourists arrive, long before the sun even climbs over its broken arches. If you stand there long enough in that quiet, something else stirs, an echo, faint yet unmistakable. It's not the sound of cheering crowds or clashing steel, but something darker, something whispered, something Rome tried and failed to bury. Because beneath the legends of gladiators and heroes lies a secret so grotesque that even Rome's own historians softened their words when hinting at it. They spoke of spectacula crudilissima, spectacles so merciless, so unnatural, that the empire itself seemed ashamed. And among them was an event so depraved that time itself tried to erase it. The day pregnant women were forced into the arena to fight wild beasts. Imagine the scene, not as ruins, but alive. The Colosseum, towering in pristine marble, its seats packed shoulder to shoulder with 50,000 Roman citizens. Senators draped in purple, merchants in worn tunics, slaves fanning nobles beneath the scorching sun, a sea of expectation, pulsing with bloodlust. Today wasn't about gladiators or war reenactments. Today promised something different, something whispered about in taverns, something meant to shock even the jaded elite. The emperor had ordered it personally, not for justice, not for tradition, but for control. These women, condemned by imperial decree, were symbols of defiance. Some were accused of political betrayal, others of religious insolence, and some simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rome had many ways to punish its enemies, but none made a statement as chilling as this: the execution of a mother before she ever held her child. Deep below, the Colosseum's hypogeomet's underground labyrinth of cages, pulleys, and darkness was already awake. Slaves hurried with torches, illuminating stone walls stained by decades of violence. Lions paced inside iron-barred cages, their golden eyes glinting in the flickering light. Bears, chained to wooden posts, grunted and clawed at the ground, their breath steaming in the cold subterranean air. They had been starved for days, their hunger carefully crafted for the spectacle above. In a small chamber near the central lift, the condemned women waited. Some held their swollen bellies protectively, whispering prayers or promises to children who would never see daylight. Others stared blankly at the walls, their minds already broken by the cruelty of what awaited them. The guards watched with indifference. To them, these women were not mothers, daughters, or wives. They were props, living tools for Rome's theater of fear. Above, the crowd grew restless. They stamped their feet. They shouted for the emperor to begin. They wanted shock. They wanted novelty. They wanted to witness power made visible through suffering. And in that growing roar, you could hear the truth of Roman Empire built not just on conquest, but on spectacle, on the belief that violence could entertain, instruct, and intimidate, all at once. As the emperor rose from his seat, draped in purple and surrounded by guards, the stadium fell into a tense silence. With a single gesture, he signaled that the performance would begin. Deep beneath the arena, a slave blew a horn. The machinery groaned to life. The women, shaking, were led toward the platform that would lift them from the darkness into a world where survival was impossible. As they stepped onto the elevator platform, the last thing they saw was the torchlight flickering behind them. The last thing they heard was the growl of a starving beast. The last thing they felt was the cold iron of chains biting into their wrists. And then, the platform began to rise. The sand above awaited. To understand how Rome descended to such depths, we must go back beyond the spectacle, beyond the cruelty, to the heartbeat of an empire obsessed with domination. By the time the Colosseum reached its peak, Rome ruled millions across continents. Its legions marched with precision. Its roads stretched like veins across Europe and Africa. And its emperors wielded absolute power. But power in Rome was never quiet. It demanded performance. It demanded display. The Colosseum became the perfect stage for this performance of authority. Each event, from gladiatorial combat to public executions, was a carefully orchestrated message. It reminded citizens of the emperor's might and warned enemies of the consequences of rebellion. The games were a political tool, a way to keep the populace distracted and appeased with bread and circuses. But over time, the demand for novelty grew. The usual spectacles began to lose their shock value. The crowd, and the emperors who catered to them, craved something more extreme. This hunger for the grotesque is what led to the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was considered one of the most dishonorable deaths, reserved for the lowest criminals, runaway slaves, and followers of unsanctioned religions. The victims were often unarmed, sometimes tied to stakes, meant to be torn apart for entertainment. But forcing pregnant women into this fate crossed a line, even for Rome. It wasn't just an execution. It was a psychological weapon. This act targeted the very foundation of society, motherhood, and the promise of a future. By destroying both in one public act, the emperor sent a message of total power. He could not only end a life, but erase a lineage. He controlled not just the present, but the future itself. This wasn't merely punishment. It was a declaration that no one, not even the unborn, was safe from the emperor's wrath. For the women themselves, it was a horror beyond comprehension. They faced a dual terror, the fear for their own lives and the agony for the innocent lives they carried. Each kick from within was a reminder of what was about to be lost. In that arena, they weren't just individuals. They were mothers fighting a hopeless battle to protect their children, even in their final moments. The audience reaction was likely complex. While many would have reveled in the brutal display of power, others, even among the bloodthirsty crowd, might have felt a flicker of unease. Roman society, for all its brutality, held certain traditions and pieties sacred, including the family. To see this violated so publicly could have been deeply unsettling. But dissent was dangerous. In a stadium, under the watchful eye of the emperor and his guards, silence or cheers were the only safe responses. So, why isn't this story more widely known? Why don't we see it depicted in movies or taught in every history class? The answer lies in the nature of history itself. It is written by the victors, and often by those who wish to present a certain image. Roman historians, like Tacitus and Suetonius, did hint at the depravities of certain emperors, but often did so with coded language. The spectacular crudilissima were mentioned, but the graphic details were often omitted, perhaps out of shame, or perhaps because they were too horrific to record plainly. The fall of Rome and the subsequent rise of Christianity also played a role. Early Christians, many of whom were victims of the arena, focused on the stories of martyrs and faith, not the specific methods of their execution. Over centuries, the Colosseum became a symbol of imperial power, of martyrdom, and eventually, of ruin. The darkest, most specific horrors were smoothed over by time, leaving behind the more glorious or palatable tales of gladiators. But the silence from the past does not mean it didn't happen. The whispers remain, embedded in the very stones of the Colosseum. When you walk through its arches today, you are walking on ground that soaked up the blood of the innocent. The echoes you hear aren't just of cheering crowds. They are the silent screams of those who were sacrificed for a spectacle. The story of the pregnant women in the arena is a chilling reminder of what happens when power is unchecked and when entertainment is derived from human suffering. Remember the stories that Rome tried to bury because they hold the most important lessons.